Zora Williams thought marrying a millionaire would be her salvation, a way to save her family from ruin, but she was dead wrong. Trapped in a cold, eerie mansion, isolated from the world, she soon realizes her charming older husband is hiding something monstrous. Late at night, she hears whispers through locked doors, discovers missing wives, and stumbles upon a horrifying secret buried beneath the estate. Now she's running for her life, with a ruthless killer watching her every move. Will she escape before she becomes his next victim? Or will she end up like the others, a name on a missing persons report? Before we dive in, buckle up, get ready, and subscribe for a special surprise tomorrow. Zora Williams gripped the eviction notice in her trembling hands, her chest tightening as she read the words again. Past due, final warning. The reality pressed down on her like a weight she couldn't shake. She turned to look at her mother, frail and exhausted, asleep on the worn-out couch. Her younger brother Malik sat at the kitchen table, poring over his schoolwork, oblivious to the storm about to swallow them whole. The pile of unpaid medical bills beside him was a cruel reminder of how dire their situation had become. She had done everything. Worked extra shifts at the diner, pawned off jewelry, skipped meals just to keep the lights on. But it wasn't enough. It was never enough. Her phone buzzed, breaking her spiraling thoughts. The message was from Theo Harrington. Need to talk. Meet me tonight. Her stomach twisted. She knew what he wanted. He had made his proposal clear before, and she had rejected it, holding on to some semblance of pride. But now she was out of time, out of options. Theo Harrington was a man who exuded power. Wealth dripped from every word he spoke, from the way he carried himself as if the world bowed at his feet. He had been a frequent customer at the high-end restaurant where she used to work, always watching her with those unreadable gray eyes. When she was laid off, he had swooped in like a savior, offering her something unimaginable, a marriage proposal, not for love, not for romance, but an arrangement, a transaction. His words echoed in her mind. Marry me, and your problems disappear. Your mother's medical bills gone. Your brother's tuition paid. You'll never struggle again, Zora. She told herself she would never sell herself for money, that she could find another way. But as she stood in the doorway of their tiny apartment, staring at the final eviction notice, she realized there was no other way. That night, she met Theo at an exclusive restaurant, a place where the silverware probably cost more than her monthly rent. He smiled when she arrived, but it wasn't warmth. It was certainty. He already knew her answer before she spoke. I'll do it, she said, voice steady despite the storm inside her. He reached across the table, brushing his fingers over hers. The touch sent a shiver down her spine. You won't regret this. 3 weeks later, Zora Williams became Mrs. Theodore Harrington. The wedding was small, private, with no friends or family. Theo claimed it was for discretion. That high society thrived on privacy. She wore a designer gown, her fingers adorned with diamonds, but she felt like a beautifully wrapped gift, handed over to a stranger. That night, he took her to his estate, a towering mansion hidden behind iron gates. The house was breathtaking, an architectural masterpiece, but as she stepped inside, an uneasy feeling settled in her stomach. The air was thick, suffocating. The grand chandelier cast eerie shadows on the marble floor. Theo wrapped an arm around her waist, pressing a kiss to her temple. Welcome home, darling. Zora forced a smile, but something deep inside her whispered that she had just walked into a cage. The heavy oak doors of the mansion shut behind Zora with a soft but decisive click, sealing her inside her new life. The silence was thick, unnatural. No sounds of the city, no distant voices, just the hum of the chandeliers above and the faint ticking of an unseen clock. The grand foyer stretched before her, with spiraling staircases leading to places unknown and endless hallways vanishing into darkness. The walls were lined with oil paintings of stern-faced men, their hollow eyes watching her every move. Theo's hand rested lightly on the small of her back as he guided her through the halls, his touch almost possessive. I know it's a lot to take in, but you'll get used to it. His voice was smooth, controlled. This is your home now. Zora forced a nod, though unease curled in her stomach. The mansion was beautiful, yes, but it was too quiet, too still. They walked through a massive dining room, its long table fit for royalty. A woman stood by the far wall, straight-backed, hands clasped in front of her. She was in her early 50s, her gray-streaked hair pulled into a tight bun, her uniform crisp. This is Isabel, Theo introduced, barely sparing her a glance. She's the head housekeeper. If you need anything, she'll take care of it. Zora met the woman's gaze, expecting warmth or maybe a polite smile. Instead, Isabel's expression was unreadable, her eyes dark and assessing. There was something almost pitying in the way she looked at her. Welcome, Mrs. Harrington, Isabel said, her voice even yet distant. "Let me know if you require anything." Zora barely had time to respond before Theo steered her away, leading her through the labyrinth of hallways until they reached the master bedroom. It was massive, with vaulted ceilings and a four-poster bed draped in silk sheets. A fireplace crackled in the corner, casting flickering shadows across the room. Theo turned to face her, his sharp features softened by the warm glow. "This is where we start our life together," he said, tucking a loose curl behind her ear. "I'll take care of you, Zora. You'll never have to worry about anything again." She swallowed, nodding. This was what she had chosen. Security, stability, a future. But that night, as she lay in the massive bed beside Theo, listening to his steady breathing, the silence of the mansion grew louder. She turned onto her side, staring at the darkened ceiling, sleep refusing to come. Then she heard it, a soft creak. Her breath hitched. The sound wasn't from the bedroom. It came from somewhere beyond, out in the hallway, slow, deliberate. Her heart pounded as she sat up, straining to listen. But just as suddenly as it came, the sound stopped, swallowed by the mansion's eerie stillness. She turned toward Theo, but he was still, his face serene in the dim light. If he heard anything, he didn't react. Zora lay back down, but sleep never came. The next morning, Zora woke to the scent of fresh linen and the distant hum of voices. Sunlight streamed through the towering windows, casting golden rays over the bedroom's expensive decor. For a moment, she almost convinced herself that last night's eerie sounds had been a dream, the product of exhaustion and nerves. But as she sat up, the lingering unease remained. Theo was already gone. His side of the bed was cold. She dressed quickly, slipping into one of the elegant silk robes that had been neatly arranged in the wardrobe. Every piece of clothing in there was pristine, high-end, and in her exact size. It was as if he had known all along that she would say yes. Downstairs, she found Theo in the dining room, reading the newspaper as breakfast was laid out before him. A feast of eggs, pastries, and fruit stretched across the long table, but he barely glanced up when she entered. "Sleep well?" he asked, sipping his coffee. Zora hesitated before nodding. "Fine." His eyes flicked up, studying her. "Good. I have a full schedule today, but you should explore the house. Get comfortable." She forced a smile, knowing it was expected. "Of course." Theo kissed her temple briefly before grabbing his suit jacket. "Isabel will take care of anything you need." And just like that, he was gone. Zora exhaled, feeling her shoulders relax slightly. The tension that came with Theo's presence always made her feel as though she was being evaluated, measured, but now, she was alone, free to wander. She started with the west wing, following the winding hallways that stretched further than she had realized the night before. The mansion was stunning, no doubt, but the emptiness made it feel hollow, like a beautifully decorated tomb. Then she saw it. A door at the far end of the hallway, slightly ajar. Zora's pulse quickened as she approached. The room beyond was dim, the air thick with the scent of aged paper and wood polish. Inside, she found a study, its bookshelves towering from floor to ceiling, stuffed with leather-bound volumes. The massive oak desk sat in the center, cluttered with papers, but it was the wall behind it that made her blood run cold. Newspaper clippings, photographs, documents pinned in a chaotic pattern. Her eyes darted across the headlines. Prominent. Socialite missing. Last seen with husband. Heiress disappears under mysterious circumstances. The faces of the women in the pictures sent a chill down her spine. They were beautiful, young, smiling, married to Theo Harrington. A sudden creak from the hallway made her jump. Zora spun, heart hammering. Theo stood in the doorway. His expression was unreadable, but his lips curved into the faintest smile. "Some doors," he said slowly, stepping inside, "are best left closed." Zora froze. Theo's presence in the dimly lit study made the room feel smaller, suffocating. He moved with deliberate ease, his fingers trailing over the edge of the desk as he stepped further inside. "I don't like when people go where they don't belong," he said, his tone calm, measured. Zora forced herself to breathe. I was just looking around. You told me to get comfortable." Theo's smile remained, but there was something cold beneath it. He reached past her and shut the door, locking them inside. "Of course," he said, brushing a stray curl from her face. "But some things in this house are private." His fingers lingered on her cheek before he turned, gathering the scattered newspaper clippings with meticulous precision. He wasn't angry, not openly, but the way he watched her as he cleaned up the evidence of his past made her skin crawl. She wanted to ask. She wanted to demand answers. Who were those women? Why did he have those articles? But something deep inside her warned against it. Instead, she swallowed her fear and nodded. "I understand." Theo studied her for a moment longer, before his shoulders relaxed. He gestured toward the door. Come on, let's not waste the morning in here. Zora didn't argue. She stepped out of the study, and as soon as the door shut behind them, she knew she wouldn't be allowed back inside. The rest of the day, she tried to shake the unease, tried to convince herself that there was a logical explanation for what she saw. Maybe Theo was just sentimental. Maybe those women were distant friends or acquaintances. Maybe she was overthinking. But that night, when the house grew quiet and Theo disappeared into his own late-night routines, the paranoia returned. She waited until his footsteps faded down the hall before slipping out of bed. Moving carefully, she followed the direction he had gone, her bare feet silent against the cold marble floors. The house felt even more hollow at night, the hallways stretching endlessly, swallowing all sound. Then she saw him. Theo stood at the far end of the corridor, near the entrance to a locked door she hadn't noticed before. His back was to her, but the way he moved, slow, deliberate, made her stomach tighten. He pulled a key from his pocket and slid it into the lock. The door creaked open just enough for him to slip inside. And then, darkness. Zora crept closer, her heart pounding. She pressed her ear against the cold wood, straining to hear a shuffle, a muffled noise like something being dragged. Then, a whisper, low, unintelligible. A chill ran down her spine. She stepped back, heart racing, every instinct screaming at her to run. Whatever was behind that door she wasn't supposed to know, and she was suddenly very, very sure that if Theo ever caught her trying to find out, she wouldn't leave this mansion alive. Zora barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the locked door, heard the muffled noises behind it, felt the cold weight of fear pressing down on her chest. By morning, she had made a decision. She needed answers. Theo left early, as he always did, slipping into his tailored suit and kissing her forehead before disappearing for the day. As soon as the front door shut behind him, she threw off the sheets and got to work. She moved carefully through the mansion, testing doors, searching for anything that might give her a clue about what lay behind that locked room. Most of the doors were open, leading to extravagant but empty spaces, unused sitting rooms, grand dining halls, and opulent guest suites. The house was enormous, yet it felt abandoned, as if no one had truly lived here in a long time. Then she found the study again. The door was locked now, but that didn't stop her. She had seen Theo leave his keys in the drawer of the hallway console before, and sure enough, when she checked, there they were. Her hands trembled as she fit the key into the lock. The door clicked open, and she stepped inside. The room was just as she had left it, the scent of old paper and polished wood lingering in the air. But this time she wasn't just glancing at the articles. She was reading them. Young heiress goes missing. Last seen with husband. Socialite's disappearance sparks investigation. No leads. Each article was connected. Each woman had been married to Theo, and none of them were ever seen again. Her breath hitched as she turned to a desk drawer, yanking it open. Inside, she found a collection of jewelry, bracelets, rings, lockets, each one unique, each one clearly belonging to someone else. Her fingers grazed over a delicate gold wedding band. A knot formed in her stomach, then she saw it. A photograph buried beneath the trinkets. Theo stood beside a woman, his arm wrapped around her in a possessive grip. She was young, beautiful, with dark curls cascading over her shoulders. Her smile was soft, but her eyes looked just like Zora's did now, wary, trapped. Scrawled at the bottom of the photo was a name, Eleanor Harrington. Zora sucked in a sharp breath. She had never heard Theo mention an Eleanor before. Hands shaking, she dug deeper into the drawer, past the papers, past the jewelry, until her fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. A key, a single aged key. She knew without question what door it unlocked. The realization sent ice through her veins. Before she could even think about what to do next, a voice behind her made her blood turn to stone. What exactly do you think you're doing? Zora spun around. Theo stood in the doorway, and this time, he wasn't smiling. Zora's breath caught in her throat. Theo stood in the doorway, his presence filling the room with an unnatural stillness. The warm charm he usually wore like a mask was gone. In its place was something colder, something calculating. She forced herself to stay calm, to swallow down the panic clawing at her throat. I was just looking for something, she said, her voice too thin, too unsteady. Theo's eyes flicked to the open drawer, to the scattered papers and jewelry, then to the key clutched tightly in her hand. His expression didn't change, but the room suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. That doesn't belong to you, he said quietly, stepping inside. Zora's fingers curled around the key, pulse hammering. I found this in your desk. And? The sharpness in his voice made her take a step back, but she held her ground. Who is Eleanor? For a moment, he didn't respond. Then, slow and deliberate, he shut the door behind him. The sound of the latch clicking into place sent a chill down her spine. "She was my wife," Theo finally said, his tone unreadable. Zora's mouth felt dry. "You never mentioned her." His gaze darkened. "Because she left." She studied him, searching for any flicker of emotion. Anger, grief, guilt, but there was nothing. Just cool indifference. Zora's grip on the key tightened. Left? Or disappeared like the others? Something shifted in his expression. Just for a second. An almost imperceptible flicker of amusement, as if she had just stepped into a game she didn't know she was playing. "You've been reading too much, my love," he said smoothly, stepping closer. Zora's pulse pounded in her ears. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she forced herself to stand still. "You keep locks on doors," she said, her voice low. "You hide things." "Why?" Theo let out a soft chuckle, but it didn't reach his eyes. Some things are best left in the past. Her heartbeat was a drum in her chest, and some things don't stay buried. The silence between them stretched, tense and suffocating. Then without warning, Theo lunged. Zora barely had time to react before his hand closed around her wrist, gripping too tightly. The key slipped from her fingers, clattering to the floor. His face was inches from hers, his breath warm, his grip ironclad. "Do you know what happens?" he murmured. "To people who don't respect boundaries." Zora's stomach twisted. Theo held her gaze for another moment before, just as suddenly, his grip loosened. He picked up the key, rolling it between his fingers, before slipping it into his pocket. Then he smiled, but it wasn't a reassuring smile. It was a warning. "Dinner's in an hour," he said, turning for the door. "Wear something nice." And then he was gone. Zora stood frozen, her body trembling. She knew now, without a doubt, she was trapped. Zora sat at the dinner table, forcing herself to keep her hands steady as she lifted her fork. Across from her, Theo ate with the same poised elegance as always, sipping his wine, cutting into his steak with smooth, deliberate movements. It was as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't nearly crushed her wrist in his grip, hadn't stolen the key from her hand, hadn't all but confirmed that she was living inside a prison disguised as a home. She forced herself to chew, to swallow, to breathe. This wasn't the time to panic. She needed a plan. Theo wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, watching her closely. "You're quiet tonight." Zora managed a small smile. "Just tired." His eyes flicked to her wrist, where a faint bruise was already forming. "I'm sure you are." She resisted the urge to recoil under his gaze. If she pushed too hard, if she made him truly suspicious, she wouldn't get another chance. So she played along. After dinner, Theo retreated to his study, locking the door behind him. That was his ritual, and she needed to use it against him. Zora waited until the house was silent before slipping out of bed. She moved carefully, stepping lightly across the cold marble floors, listening for any signs that he might be near. She had lost the key, but she knew where it led, the locked door at the end of the hallway. Her pulse quickened as she approached. If she was right, if she could find another way inside, she might finally learn the truth about Theo Harrington. She pressed her ear against the door. Nothing. No sounds. No movement. Zora exhaled, her fingers tracing the edges of the lock. She needed something thin, something she could slide inside. Looking for something? Her body went rigid. She turned slowly. A man stood at the far end of the hallway, half hidden in the shadows. He wasn't one of Theo's staff. He was unkempt, rugged, his clothes casual but slightly wrinkled, as if he had been standing outside for hours, waiting. "Who are you?" she whispered. The man took a step closer, eyes sharp. "My name is Malcolm Hayes. I need to talk to you." Her pulse spiked. "I don't know you," she said, backing away. "No, but I know about you," he countered. "I know about Theo." Her breath caught in her throat. Malcolm lowered his voice. "Listen to me, Zora. He's dangerous. I've been investigating him for years, and I need your help to prove what he's done." The words sent ice through her veins. "You're wrong," she whispered, but even as she said it, she knew she didn't believe it. Malcolm's expression was grim. "Am I?" She swallowed hard, glancing over her shoulder toward the locked door. Then, quietly, she asked, "What do you know?" Malcolm's gaze darted down the hall before he stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Theo Harrington isn't who he says he is. He's been married before, several times, and every single one of his wives has disappeared." Zora felt the air thicken around her. "I saw the articles," she whispered, her pulse hammering. "The women in his study. Eleanor. Who was she?" Malcolm's jaw tightened. "His last wife. No one's seen her in 2 years. The police never pressed, but I did. I know Theo was the last person to see her alive." Zora swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling deep inside her. She had suspected it, had felt the darkness creeping around her ever since she set foot in this house. But hearing it spoken aloud made it real. "How do you know all this?" she asked. "I'm a journalist," Malcolm said. "I've been following him for years, but I could never get close enough to prove anything. Not until now." his eyes locked onto hers. "You're the only one inside this house, Zora. You're the only one who can stop him." Her stomach twisted. The idea of standing up to Theo, of exposing him, felt impossible. He had all the power, all the control, and if he so much as suspected she was turning against him. The sound of footsteps echoed from down the hall. Zora's breath hitched. Malcolm cursed under his breath. "You need to go," she whispered, shoving him toward a side door leading to the garden. "I'll be back," he promised. "Find out what's behind that locked door." Then he was gone. Zora pressed herself against the wall, heart racing as Theo's shadow stretched across the marble floor. He emerged from the darkness, eyes sharp, his presence swallowing the space between them. "What are you doing out here?" he asked. Zora forced a small smile, hoping the dim lighting would hide her shaking hands. "I couldn't sleep." Theo studied her for a moment, then reached out, tucking a stray curl behind her ear. The gesture was gentle, possessive. "You should be more careful," he murmured. "Wandering around at night isn't safe." The words sent a chill down her spine. She nodded, forcing herself to look away first. "I'll go back to bed." Theo's fingers brushed down her arm before he finally released her. "Good girl." Zora turned, walking away, forcing herself not to run. As soon as she was back in the bedroom, she locked the door and collapsed against it, pressing a hand to her mouth to muffle the ragged breath escaping her lips. Malcolm's words replayed in her mind. "You're the only one inside this house, Zora. You're the only one who can stop him." She glanced toward the window, toward the locked door at the end of the hall. She had to know. She had to see what Theo was hiding. Zora spent the next day pretending to smile, pretending to be the obedient wife Theo expected. Every meal, every casual touch, every glance across the lavish rooms of the mansion was an act. But inside, her mind was racing. She had one goal: get into the locked room. Theo left that afternoon for business, kissing her on the cheek as he slid his cufflinks into place. "Be good," he murmured before stepping out the door. Zora forced a sweet smile. Always. The moment the gates closed behind his car, she moved. She had no key. Theo had taken it, but there had to be another way. She searched the house, scouring drawers, cabinets, even checking the inside of books. If Theo was keeping secrets, he had to have a backup plan. Then she remembered Isabel. The housekeeper had been quiet, distant, but she knew things. Zora found her in the laundry room, folding linens with slow, practiced movements. "Isabel," she said softly. The woman didn't look up. "You shouldn't be asking questions." Zora stepped closer. "Please." Isabel's hands stilled. Then after a long pause, she exhaled and reached into her apron pocket. A small silver key rested in her palm. Zora's breath caught. "You had it?" "I kept a spare," Isabel whispered. "For her." Zora's stomach twisted. She didn't have to ask who her was. She took the key, fingers trembling. "What's inside?" Isabel's gaze was heavy. "You'll see." Zora turned and walked away before she lost her nerve. Back at the hallway, she gripped the key so tightly it bit into her palm. The door loomed in front of her, silent, waiting. With a deep breath, she slid the key into the lock. It turned. The door creaked open, revealing darkness. The air inside was thick, stale, the scent of something long forgotten lingering in the shadows. Zora stepped inside, reaching for the switch. The dim glow of a single hanging light bulb flickered to life, and then she saw it. A chair in the center of the room, its wooden arms wrapped in frayed leather straps. Chains bolted to the floor. Beside it, a table of tools, rusted, stained. Her stomach lurched. And then, a dress, draped over the chair, untouched, as if waiting for someone to return. It was white, delicate, and identical to the one she wore on her wedding day. A sharp gasp caught in her throat. Footsteps. She spun around just as a shadow filled the doorway. Theo. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was quiet, controlled. "I warned you." Zora's heartbeat exploded in her chest. Then he stepped inside and locked the door behind him. Zora's breath came fast and shallow as Theo turned the key, sealing them inside. The air in the room was thick with dust and something far worse. The sharp tang of metal, the lingering scent of old fear. She took a step back, her heel nearly hitting the chair in the center of the room. Theo moved slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the moment. "I had hoped you'd be different," he said, voice smooth, almost disappointed. Zora's eyes darted to the table beside her, to the rusted tools, the chains. Her stomach churned, bile rising in her throat. "What happened to Eleanor?" she whispered. Theo exhaled, rolling his sleeves to his elbows. "She was difficult, just like you." The words hit her like ice. She knew then. Eleanor never left. None of them had. Theo sighed and took another step forward. "You had to go looking," he murmured. "You had to ruin everything." Zora's fight-or-flight instincts kicked in. There was no reasoning with him, no stalling for time. He had locked the door. The only way out was through him. Her hand darted toward the table, grabbing the heaviest tool she could find, a rusted wrench. Theo moved fast, too fast. His hand caught her wrist before she could swing, his grip like iron. Tsk, tisk, he murmured. That's no way to treat your husband. Zora twisted, slamming her knee into his stomach. Theo staggered, but he didn't let go. His other hand wrapped around her throat, squeezing just enough to send a sharp warning through her body. You think you're the first to fight back? He hissed. The first to run? Panic surged through her veins. Then, a knock. Loud, urgent. Theo's. Head snapped toward the door. The sound of Malcolm's voice rang through the hallway. Zora, are you in there? Relief and terror crashed over her at once. Theo cursed under his breath, grip tightening. You called for help, he snarled. Zora's nails dug into his wrist, fighting for air. You'll never get away with this, Theo smirked. I always do. The door burst open. Malcolm stood there, gun raised, his expression fierce. Let her go. Theo barely hesitated. With a frustrated growl, he threw Zora to the ground, her head slamming against the wooden floor. Stars exploded in her vision, but she forced herself to move, to crawl away from him. Theo turned to Malcolm, lunging. A shot rang out. Theo stumbled, gripping his side, his crisp white shirt blooming red. He didn't fall, didn't scream. He just turned, those cold, soulless eyes locking onto Zora one last time. You think this is over? He rasped. Then he collapsed. Zora gasped for breath, heart slamming against her ribs. Malcolm rushed forward, pulling her up. Come on, he said. We're getting out of here. And this time, she ran. The sirens wailed in the distance as Zora stumbled out of the mansion, Malcolm's arm steadying her. The cold night air hit her like a shock, crisp and real, a stark contrast to the suffocating walls she had been trapped inside. For the first time in weeks, she could breathe. Behind them, Theo lay motionless on the floor of the hidden room, his blood pooling beneath him. But Zora knew better than to believe it was over. He wasn't dead. Not yet. Flashing red and blue lights flooded the long driveway as police cars screeched to a stop. Officers poured out, weapons drawn, their shouts cutting through the night. Malcolm raised his hands in surrender. She's the victim. He's inside. Zora barely registered the blur of movement as officers stormed past them, disappearing into the mansion. She heard the heavy boots against the marble floors, the barked commands, and then Theo's voice. Weak, amused, defiant. I want my lawyer. Zora's hands clenched into fists. Even now, he still thought he could win. A paramedic guided her to the back of an ambulance, pressing a warm blanket around her shoulders. Ma'am, are you injured? She shook her head, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking. The bruises on her wrists, the soreness in her throat, the sting on her scalp where Theo had yanked her hair. None of it mattered. She was alive. Malcolm sat beside her, his gaze steady. They'll take him in, he said, and this time he won't walk away. Zora swallowed hard. How do you know? Because Theo had walked away before, over and over. His money, his influence, it had buried every single one of his crimes. Malcolm exhaled. Because this time, we have proof. The words sent a jolt through her. Proof. She turned toward the mansion just as the officers led Theo out. His hands were cuffed, his usually pristine suit now stained with blood. But he wasn't panicked. He wasn't shouting or resisting. He was smiling. Their eyes met across the distance and he tilted his head ever so slightly. A silent message. This isn't over. Zora's stomach churned, but she refused to look away. For so long she had been running, trapped inside his world, but she wasn't trapped anymore. She straightened, forcing herself to meet his gaze with steel in her spine. A female officer approached, voice firm. Mrs. Harrington will need your statement. Mrs. Harrington. The name felt foreign now, like something that belonged to another life. She nodded. I'm ready. Theo's smirk faltered, just for a second, and that was when Zora knew. She had already won. The courtroom was silent, the air thick with anticipation. Zora sat stiffly in the witness stand, her fingers gripping the edge of the polished wood. Across the room, Theo sat at the defense table, clad in an expensive suit, his face unreadable. His lawyers had worked tirelessly to paint him as the victim, a misunderstood man whose wife had fallen prey to wild conspiracy theories, but the evidence spoke louder than any carefully crafted lie. The photographs, the missing women, the room. Zora took a steadying breath. He locked me inside that house, she said, her voice clear. He controlled everything, and when I found out the truth, he tried to kill me. The prosecutor nodded, guiding her through the testimony. Malcolm had helped uncover more victims, linking Theo to at least 3 other disappearances. There was no walking away from this trial, not this time. Still, Theo never broke character. He watched her with that same unwavering gaze, his expression calm, almost curious. But Zora was no longer afraid. When the verdict came, the gavel striking like thunder, the words hit the air like a final, irreversible blow. Guilty. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Theo barely reacted, but as the officers approached to take him away, he turned to her. "You think this is the end?" he murmured, low enough that only she could hear. Zora held his gaze, her pulse steady. "It is for you," she said. For the first time, a flicker of something passed through his expression. Not anger, not fear, recognition. Theo Harrington was a man who had always won, always controlled the game, and she had beaten him. When the guards led him out, the heavy doors slamming shut behind them, Zora exhaled, the tension leaving her body. In waves, she had survived. She had exposed him. She was free. Malcolm met her outside the courthouse, his hands tucked into his coat pockets. "You did it," he said. She smiled, the first real smile in months. "We did." The past still lingered, heavy and scarred, but she wasn't running anymore. She had faced the monster and won. That night, she stood at the ocean's edge, watching the waves crash against the shore. The wind carried away the weight of the past, and for the first time in a long time, the world felt open. A second chance, a new beginning. Zora closed her eyes, letting the salty air fill her lungs. Then, without looking back, she walked forward, leaving the golden cage behind.